A wide-body twin turns final for one of the busiest runways on Earth. The airplane is configured, the localizer is centered, and a steady descent profile should carry it to the aiming point. The auto-throttle calls for a modest rise in power to balance the extra drag of landing flap and gear. Instead of a smooth spool-up, both engines hesitate. Airspeed trends down, the sink rate builds, and the touchdown point slips beneath the nose. How can a long-range jet that has crossed a continent and an ocean arrive over the fence short of energy with engines commanded, yet not delivering? That contradiction opens the first gap, if nothing fails in the classic sense. What steals the thrust at the very moment it is needed most? The captain takes control as the crew works to keep glide path, runway alignment, and configuration within limits, buying seconds in a narrowing margin, while the auto-throttle continues to ask for power that does not arrive. The paradox of quiet power at the end of a routine approach becomes the thread that will guide the investigation to a very specific place inside the fuel system. The flight is British Airways 38, a Boeing 777-236ER inbound from Beijing to London Heathrow on January 17, 2008. The route tracks winter air over Mongolia and Siberia, where the cruise is unusually cold, still within limits, but cold enough for fuel temperature to become an active parameter on the flight deck. The crew monitors it, the systems record it, and the aircraft continues uneventfully toward top of descent. Heathrow sequences the flight to the ILS for runway 27L. The senior first officer flies, the captain monitors. Flap and gear selections add drag in planned steps, and the auto-throttle responds as it always does until the final minute, when the commanded acceleration is not matched by actual engine response. The second gap forms here. Instruments do not show a classic engine failure, yet thrust is inadequate for a stabilized approach. The airplane crosses the airport boundary low and slow, touches down short of the paved surface, and slides onto the airfield. There is significant structural damage but no post-impact fire. Survivors evacuate promptly. Those facts: stable systems, low thrust, survivable undershoot set the scope of what the investigation must explain. The pacing of the descent looks ordinary until small details begin to diverge. At clean speeds, thrust is low and fuel flows are modest. As the airplane descends and begins configuring, drag increases. The expected response is more fuel, more N1 in a steady energy state around the glide slope. Instead, the first hint appears as sluggish acceleration, then a split in commanded versus delivered thrust. The captain assumes control, managing pitch to preserve angle of attack while the crew trims drag by delaying further flap changes as long as reasonable. Another gate appears. Do they have enough height to reclaim airspeed? Pitch alone cannot generate energy, only thrust can, and the engines are slow to respond. Now a third gap opens. Why do both engines behave the same way at the same time? The cockpit indications are not those of flameout or surge. There is no fire, no vibration spike, no dramatic rise in exhaust gas temperature, just insufficient fuel flow to match the auto-throttle's demand. Seconds later, the 707 touches down short of the threshold in the grass undershoot and decelerates onto the airfield. The core decision logic the crew must execute: keep the wings level, hold the runway center line, avoid over-rotating into a stall, remains intact, and that discipline drives survivability. The airplane stops with substantial damage but without a post-impact fire. The data recorders capture a precise picture. Both engine controllers command more fuel, but the engines cannot ingest enough of it to answer the call. That timeline becomes the spine of the investigation. The approach phase compresses multiple clocks into seconds. Altitude unwinds faster than usual. The auto-throttle commands more thrust as drag rises, but actual fuel flow does not keep pace. Electrical load management shifts as engine output sags. The APU start is initiated. The crew chooses energy-conserving actions available at low height, holding a slightly reduced landing flap for drag relief as long as the profile allows, yet the fundamental equation does not change. There is not enough thrust to arrest the sink rate. The airplane lands short of the runway and slides forward onto the paved surface. Evacuation follows quickly and in good order. The investigative beat at the end of this part is crisp. The crew has fuel on board. The engine electronic controllers are awake and commanding, and yet the engines cannot deliver the demanded power. The fourth gap, therefore, is not why did the crew run out of fuel, but what blocked usable fuel from reaching the burners. That is a hardware and physics question more than a procedural one, and it points upstream from the fuel metering valve into the maze of lines and heat exchangers between the tanks and the engines.
Heat stress near the strut.
Confirmed. Recording data now.
Fuel systems do quiet work. They move a dense, cold fluid along long paths, through filters and pumps and heat exchangers, at rates that vary dramatically from idle to go around. In very cold crews, jet fuel can dissolve or carry minute amounts of water. Under certain thermal histories, that water can form microscopic, soft ice. Picture a city water plant feeding neighborhoods through a screen at the intake of wind-blown slush mats across the screen. Opening every faucet downstream changes almost nothing. The pump spins, but flow stays starved. Or imagine snow pressed against a car's radiator grill. The thermostat opens. The water pump turns, yet airflow is choked right where it matters. The investigation will demonstrate that a similar blanket can form on the face of the fuel-to-oil heat exchanger FOHE in each engine of this 777. During the exceptionally cold cruise, small quantities of soft ice build within parts of the fuel path without causing trouble at low flow. Later, when warmer fuel and higher flows arrive in descent and approach, the ice dislodges and rides the stream forward. If enough soft ice reaches the FOHE face at once, it can blanket its fine passages and restrict the mass flow of fuel just when thrust is commanded. Flight data show the controllers driving the fuel metering valves wide. The thrust does not follow because the upstream restriction prevents fuel from getting there. That precise signature, commanded but not delivered, matches the recorded behavior on both engines of BA38 and becomes the key that unlocks the mystery.
500, minimums, 50, 30, 10.
Cleared to land, runway 28.
Now the human system faces a problem that looks like lag, not failure. In the status quo model, auto throttle commands lead to predictable engine response. Here the loop breaks in a subtle way. Workload rises fast, fly the path, watch speed, adjust configuration, cross-check engine instruments, and decide whether any non-normal checklist is feasible at such low height. Authority transfer is clean, the captain flies, the pilot flying supports, and the call to protect energy and alignment remains the top priority. Plan continuation bias exerts pressure because the runway is in sight and the landing looks almost there. Yet the crew recognizes that only thrust can fix energy, and there is no time to wait for a sluggish response. Fixation is kept at bay long enough to preserve attitude control and runway alignment through ground contact. Another curiosity sits inside these seconds. If rolling the thrust levers to idle could melt the restriction at the FOHE, would there be time to benefit? Testing later shows that an idle interval can help clear a blanket of soft ice, but at a few hundred feet above ground, the margin is too thin to attempt diagnostic cycles. The informational beat is important data, and recorded parameters demonstrate adequate fuel quantity, normal monitoring in crews, and engine controllers that behave properly. The shortfall is physical restriction at the FOHE face, not fuel exhaustion, not contamination by foreign debris, and not a controller software fault. That finding relieves the crew of blame and refocuses the industry on the physics of fuel icing after very cold cruises. The formal investigation becomes a test program. Specialists build rigs that replicate the 777's fuel paths and thermal histories. Engines run on stands with controlled fuel temperature and flow. Researchers vary water content within normal specifications and cycle fuel through cold soak conditions, followed by approach-like increases in flow and temperature. The results converge. Soft ice can accrue in normal, on-specification fuel at very cold, low flow conditions. As flows rise later in flight, that ice can release and travel downstream. When it reaches the FOHE face used on Trent 800 engines of the period, It can blanket the inlet and restrict fuel to levels that reproduce the rollbacks recorded on BA38. Data from the event corroborate that the engine controllers order the fuel metering valves open. The engines answer only to the extent the restricted flow allows. Another test result matters operationally. Reducing thrust to idle for a short period allows oil side heat to melt or loosen the blanket so that a subsequent throttle advance can restore response valuable knowledge if altitude permits. With these threads assembled, the early curiosity gaps close in sequence, why both engines behave similarly shared physics and identical hardware, why instrumentation looks normal, no internal breakage or surge, and why the event is tied to thermal history rather than a single contaminated tank. The report issues clear findings and recommendations, anchoring them in a chain of cause and effect that starts with a very cold cruise and ends with restricted fuel flow at the FOHE. Change arrives through both hardware and operations. Regulators require that the FOHE on affected Trent 800 engines be replaced with a redesigned unit whose inlet geometry is far more tolerant of soft ice release. The revised face removes the fine, blanket-susceptible features and presents a flush configuration tested to very low fuel temperatures and a range of flow transients. Europe's regulator mandates the retrofit through EASA Airworthiness Directive 2009-0142, effective July 27, 2009. The United States issues corresponding directives to prevent FOHE blockage and unacceptable power loss. Operators comply through the mandated service bulletins, and the fleet is modified on a defined schedule. Operationally, interim procedures are added, expanded attention to fuel temperature management near top of descent, and a simple, memorable response. If engines fail to accelerate in cold soak scenarios, retard to idle briefly, then re-advance to verify restoration. The lesson set is practical, and specific certification and analysis must address not only ice formation, but the transient behavior of sudden ice migration. Recording positions of key fuel system devices helps future diagnostics, and training should separate fuel temperature within limits from fuel system icing risk after long, very cold cruise. The information beat closes design, rulemaking, and training converge on the same physics and reduce the chance of recurrence. With the chain complete, the narrative reads clearly. A very cold, long-duration cruise sets the stage for soft ice accrual in parts of the fuel system. Late in the flight, approach-driven fuel flows rise and carry that ice toward the FOHE of both engines. The FOHE face, as then configured, allows a blanket-style restriction that starves the engines just when power is commanded, creating an approach energy shortfall. The cruise discipline keeps the airplane controllable and aligned. The structure absorbs the landing and the undershoot. The absence of a post-impact fire preserves survivability, and evacuation proceeds quickly. Investigators translate hard physics into clear recommendations. Regulators compel a hardware fix, and operators adopt procedural refinements. The industry's safety net tightens in exactly the place the event exposed. The last gaps are closed. Why there was low thrust without a classic failure. Why both engines were affected. Why no fire followed. And how a precise modification prevents the same sequence from repeating. The event becomes not just a story of loss of energy on short final, but a case study in how data, tests, and design changes turn an edge case into a safer fleet. If this investigation helps make sense of how hidden physics can surface at the worst moment, and how disciplined flying, rigorous analysis, and targeted engineering convert surprise into safety, consider staying with this channel as we continue to translate complex events into practical lessons for every pilot and passenger. Thank you for valuing careful, evidence-based storytelling that keeps respect and responsibility at the center.